I don't know what I am, but I taste really good. What's up? It's the Culture Detective here investigating your favorite albums. And today I'm going to do an album review on the latest Coldplay album, Music of the Spheres. Coldplay is a British pop rock band or rock pop band, and they have been making music for I think 2 decades already, which is really crazy. And this is their latest album, Music of the Spheres. And I would be lying. I would be absolutely lying through my teeth if I say that Coldplay is not one of the most important bands of my entire life, because they are one of the most important bands of my entire life. Part of the reason why I got into music is because of Coldplay. I mean, the first album review I ever did on this channel is a Coldplay album review. And also, when I was 13 or I think 12 years old, like 7 years ago, I received this as a birthday present because I was just such a huge Coldplay fan. And this still remains to be one of the best birthday gifts I've ever received in my entire life. Before I even became a fan of Pink Floyd and Radiohead, I was a huge, huge Coldplay fan. Albums like A Rush of Blood to the Head and Viva La Vida or Death and All His Friends are amazing albums that I still really love to this day. And even albums like X and Y, which is an album that not a lot of people like. I guess Coldplay fans love this album for sure, but people outside of Coldplay's fan base are kind of divided on X and Y, but I personally like X and Y a lot as well. And also Parachutes, a fantastic album. But to be very, very honest, after Viva La Vida, I think Coldplay has fallen off. We have Milo Xyloto, which is their turn to more pop-oriented music, which has a lot of highlights, but is nowhere near as good as Coldplay's first four albums. The album Ghost Stories see Coldplay turn to a more electronic and more melancholic sound, which is interesting for them, but the results are not necessarily all that great. Things turn even more sour with the album A Head Full of Dreams, which certainly has its highlights, but again, it's nowhere near as good as Coldplay's first six albums. And then I think 2 years ago, Coldplay released Everyday Life, an album so forgettable that I didn't even remember this album all that well because there just isn't a single memorable song from this album. So I was really worried because, again, I was a huge Coldplay fan 7 years ago, but now things have changed and Coldplay has gone south. Another indicator that Coldplay's music has gone south is that on this album, Music of the Spheres, Coldplay is collaborating with the notorious, the prolific Swedish songwriter-producer Max Martin, who has produced and wrote some of the biggest and catchiest hits of the last 3 decades, but we all know that Max Martin would not really be the way to go if you're trying to be a little bit more experimental or trying to break the mold, which is something that Coldplay desperately needs to do, especially with their recent albums. Anyways, for every single album, Coldplay latches onto a specific aesthetic, and on this album, they latch onto the spacey alien aesthetic. Of course, on the album cover, you see these planets and these spheres that are basically planets and these nebulas and stars. So obviously, Coldplay is going to space this time. Except my issue with this album aesthetic is that Coldplay doesn't really incorporate that spacey aesthetic and that astronomical aesthetic beyond how the instrumental sounds and occasional lyrical references. Whereas if you go back in time and go back to, say, Viva la Vida, they really take on a whole neoclassical French Revolution aesthetic throughout the entire album, which is very interesting and flavorful. Even Milo Xyloto and Ghost Stories have more of an aesthetic value than Music of the Spheres. And on top of that, usually Coldplay album covers are pretty interesting, but this album cover just looks very cartoonish and not in a good way. Listening to this album feels like being scammed. Feels like being catfished. Because the first single that Coldplay has released for this album is Coloratura, which is a 10-minute long prog rock monster. What? Coldplay? A 10-minute long prog rock song? What? What timeline am I living on? What is this? What is this madness? And obviously everybody got their hopes up thinking that Coldplay will be releasing something interesting, finally, after a long time. But unfortunately, we have been scammed. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been scammed. Because aside from Coloratura, pretty much every single track off of Music of the Spheres is a generic, bland pop song that is very average and very basic. And then we have these emoji tracks that are basically pointless and just feels like a very desperate attempt to appeal to a younger audience and a newer fan base. The album starts off with a planet Saturn Emoji. That's kind of a tame intro track, and while it isn't a terrible intro track, in all honesty, but like, how did we get from Life in Technicolor to this? How? And then it transitions to Higher Power, which is one of the lead-up singles to the album, and it is as generic and as basic as it gets. It is a pop song that's just very mild. Like, the verses, the choruses, they're just not really all that colorful. It has somewhat spacey aesthetic, and that's all there is. There's nothing special about it. The chorus is just so stiff and kind of robotic. We get these big spacey synths and peppy drums, and they're all kinda mild, not really all that interesting. And then we have the track Humankind, which is another really generic pop song with some overly optimistic lyrics about how we're all humans. The bright blaring synths and the sunny guitars are, again, not terrible, but I would not say that they're good. They're just mediocre. They're just lackluster. And the chorus is just repetitive as hell. I know, I know, I know. That is then immediately followed by another emoji interlude with some shimmery star emoji as the track title, and the interlude just feels pointless because it doesn't lead up to anywhere. It doesn't build up to anywhere. It's kind of spacey and starstruck, and then it just transitions to this very bland guitar ballad. Like, this interlude has no place in there, and I love a good interlude, you know? Like, Clipping's latest album has some of the best interludes I've ever listened to, and I would not skip the interludes when I listen to the album because they're just that good. But in this album, the interludes they're just pointless. They just have no point being there. The track Let Somebody Go features Selena Gomez, and it is essentially a heartbreak guitar ballad with some overly positive conclusion at the back end of the track, of course. And Selena Gomez and Chris Martin duetting on this track, and it's boring as hell. It's as dull as wallpaper. It is just very slow and spacey, and the verses and the choruses aren't even that distinct from one another. The whole track just feels like one very boring, empty wasteland. And then afterwards, it is followed by, finally, a change of pace, where instead of writing a very generic pop song, the band moves towards a more interesting direction where we have the track Human Heart, which is a heart emoji featuring Jacob Collier and We Are King. And this entire track is basically this ghostly gospel a cappella track where there are no instrumentals and it's all soft, gentle choir singing. And while I'm happy that finally the album has a change of pace, it still doesn't take away from the fact that this track in and of itself is bland and basic as hell as far as gospel a cappella goes. It is just very basic still. And then we have the track People of the Pride, where the band once again takes on an interesting change of pace after the very generic first three tracks on the album. And what essentially happens on People of the Pride is that we have this large, banging, groovy bass, skippy drums, and right off the bat, it is very apparent that this track is like a ripoff of a Muse song. Like, again, I appreciate that the band is trying something different on this album, but it still does not take away from the fact that the music that they're making, whatever genre it is bland and basic as hell. And on top of that, this track is just so derivative. When I'm listening to this track, I was actually laughing my ass off because it's like the band is doing a very mediocre cover song of a Muse song. The lyrics on this track essentially deal with division, people being divided, arguing with each other, but the lyrical depth of this track doesn't go anywhere beyond there's a man who's walking around like he's boss, like he's owning the fucking lot. Then this track is followed by Biutyful, which is easily my least favorite track on the entire album. Instrumentally, it is basically your average generic pop song, and lyrically, it is basically a love song. But what really makes this track the worst track on this album, also one of the worst songs that Coldplay has ever written, or Max Martin has ever written, is that this track has this nasally pitched vocal that's just barely listenable. It is like screeching, and the song is 3.5 minutes long, I believe, and throughout the entire track, the vocals have been very nasal, pitched, and just very unlistenable. It is intolerable, and it is a new low point on the album. Then we have another interlude with an emoji track title which doesn't really have any point being there. Then we finally have the last leg of the album, the track My Universe featuring BTS. And when I first listened to this track, I kind of dislike it. It is bland, it is basic, it doesn't have a lot of great features. BTS and Coldplay doesn't come together in any way, shape, or form where they both have a lot of chemistry or anything. However, after repeated listens, the track grew on me. Maybe it's because My Universe is easily one of the better tracks on the entire album because other tracks are just so bland and dull. Maybe it's because the song is legitimately catchy and has more of a hook. And maybe it's because this track features BTS, there is more of a dynamic in this track. There are more changes, enough to keep my attention throughout the whole track. But on this track, we have a groovy bass, a constant drum beat, and it is a pretty catchy and fun song, albeit the music video for this song is literally one of the worst music videos I've seen this year. Finally, we have an Infinity Emoji track, and it is not an interlude because it is 3 minutes and 46 seconds long, and this is basically Coldplay's attempt at IDM with the shimmery bleeping beats and these arena noises and these vocal acapellas towards the back end of the track. And yes, this is an interesting direction that the band is going for. And on top of that, I don't think this track is that bland or anything. I mean, sure, there are tons of IDM music out there that is infinitely better than this one, infinitely better, ironically. But still, Coldplay doesn't fall flat on this track or anything, and it does build up to the 10-minute long prog rock monster that is Coloratura quite nicely at the end. Okay, so I somehow forgot to talk about the most important song on the entire album, Coloratura. The song is actually a love song, essentially. Lyrics, they are, the usual. It is a love song. But lyrically, it occasionally makes references to like stars and constellations and Galileo and stuff and things. So I guess even though lyrically I wouldn't say it's a masterpiece, it's still apparent that Coldplay has made an effort to write something interesting. But instrumentally, it is pretty damn good. I mean, we have a slow, quiet piano build up to some really dreamy piano chords, which I really love. There's a bit in the middle that quiets down, and then it builds up to a soaring guitar solo a la Pink Floyd's Comfortably Numb. And then afterwards, it ends off quietly. It is a roller coaster of musicality. And even though I think that this track is kind of like a watered down cartoon Pink Floyd, like it's Pink Floyd, but not as good. But I still appreciate Coldplay for making an effort to write something like this, and I still think it is easily the best sounding track on the entire album. So yes, the album ends off pretty nicely. I wouldn't say it ends off great, but it at least ends off way better than it started off. But still, that being said though, I still think Music of the Spheres is the worst Coldplay album so far. I didn't enjoy the first half of this album at all. The first half is extremely generic, basic, and boring. And then afterwards, it is followed by a series of tracks where Coldplay tries to experiment but ends up sounding kind of basic still. The album ends off kind of sweetly, but it does not really justify the first half at all. So, yeah, unfortunately, Coldplay has fallen off, and as much as I try my very best to like their new sound and style, I just can't. I'm sorry. My favorite track here is Coloratura, and my least favorite track is Biutyful. Also, I would like to add that Chris Martin is a genuinely nice guy. I really like him. He's a really cool dude, but damn, the music on this album is just not it. I'm giving Coldplay's Music of the Spheres a strong 3 to a light 4 out of 10. So, have you listened to the latest Coldplay album? From 1 to 10, how much would you rate it? Like if you like it, and subscribe if you want more. And thanks for watching.